Tar and salt and the breath of the deep came up with the dusk, a patient, briny exhalation that slicked the decks and made the lanterns burn with wavering halos. Victarion Greyjoy stood with his hands locked about the rail and watched the last colors drain from the sky. A lid of bruised dark cloud lay heavy over Slaver's Bay, and the wind that came out of it had the taste of iron. Beyond the black teeth of his prow, the city of Yunkai smoldered along the shore, its yellow bricks turned almost red by the fires that had not yet gone out. The sea took those reflections and broke them on its back, scattering the semblance of flame into splinters that rode the swell, were born, and were snuffed in the same instant. Behind him the Iron Fleet kept its order. Tall-fanged rams cut the bay with steady strokes. Sails furled to half, they drifted in a patient crescent beyond the reach of the city's artillery. On the warship where Victarion stood, the silence was of that sort that belongs to men who have said everything or else do not mean to say anything at all. The crew were iron-born. They had shipped, eaten, killed, and knelt for salt just as their fathers had done, and speech had nothing they needed. Only the Red Priest had words this evening, and he spoke them in the fire-pale tongue that made Victarion want to close his fist around something and break it. "The sea bears her," Makoro said, the beads of his braids rattling softly. He stood beside the brazier they had rigged aft of the mast. Even with the wind lifting the smoke and the heat fighting the air, the smell of him, the pepper and wine and something sweet that Victarion had never learned the name of, pushed at the nose. And the night bears signs. The Great One moves in the sky and the lesser two follow. She has loosed chains and she will loose them again. It is written upon the waters. Victarion did not turn his head. "It is written upon the waters that we have wasted a day," he said. "If the Yellow Men had any courage left, they would have launched by now, and we would be done with them. They see your ships and fear to die," Makoro said mildly. "They saw reavers burning their neighbors' boats and fear to lose their slaves," Victarion answered. The complaint was half-habit. The truth was that the delay suited him. It let the fleet arrive like a slow-closing fist, and it gave the tale of the black sails time to run ahead into the city. Let them whisper about iron men who traded finger bones for helm plates and named their knives. Let them quail and open their gates to the Dragon Queen to whom Victarion had come at the bidding of his brother. When he closed his eyes, the titiline of rage rose, as it always did when he thought of Euron. "The crows I had sent him east as a dog is sent to fetch a stick. Bring me the woman with 3 dragons, brother, and I will wed her, and we will set this land to bleeding." Victarion's hands tightened and made the bones click. He would fetch a prize, but it would not be laid at Euron's feet. The wind shifted, and the smell of cinders from Yunkai gave way to the smell of the great river that shadowed the city. Something reptilian lay under that odor, something that made the hairs stand along Victarion's forearms. A hissing had been in the night of late. Sailors told tales at their messes, and the tales moved like oil, slicking every tongue. Sometimes, in the pale bar-milk of dawn, Victarion had thought he could see, far inland, a shape that did not belong to hill or tower, lifting and settling like the throat of a black bellows. "The Great One," Makoro murmured very softly, following the line of his gaze. "He is restless." "Dragons are for songs," Victarion said, though the first song he had learned at his mother's knee had been a drowning chant, and its tune had taught him that all songs were a kind of lie that kept men from counting their wounds. Makoro's teeth flashed. "Everything that burns is for my god." "Your god can have Yunkai," Victarion said. "I mean to have the woman." The priest lifted his painted hands above the brazier. The flames bent to them like dogs to a whistle. "You shall have what the fires permit." Victarion growled in his chest. On his forearm, the blackened skin of his old wound itched, prickled. He rubbed it against the rail until pain climbed his arm and relit his mind. "Lower a boat," he said. "We go ashore at dawn, when she comes to take their keys." "She will not take keys," Makoro told him. Victarion had started to walk away, but the calm certainty of the priest's voice made him pause. "She will take men and words and the promise of blood. She is not a woman who likes the feel of keys in her hand. She would rather feel the haft of a spear or the reins of a horse. Her heart remembers grass and the sound of hooves, though she walks in a city today. Victarion turned fully then and watched the red man smile and look into the brazier as if it were a pool that showed the world. He did not like that smile. It had made other men follow it to better fortunes than they deserved, and it would not have Victarion Greyjoy. Dawn then, he said. It was still night on the land when the dragons came. Lanterns on the piers blurred and dew made a lace of the rigging. The city's walls were a darker black against the sky, and between the walls and the sea stretched a beach bitter with old salt and the river's filth. Victarion stood in the bow of his longboat and watched two shadows detach themselves from the blackness and grow larger as they came. One was the size of a house roof, the other smaller and bright as a coin when it turned its belly to the lantern light. The oars stumbled, and for a heartbeat the boat rocked as men forgot the sea's rhythm and remembered the wrongness of wings at night. Victarion said nothing. The smaller dragon's eyes were lamps, lemon in the dark. The larger had a slow, menacing grace to it that ought not to have belonged to a thing so large. The wind of its passing slapped the sea flat and raised it again in the same breath. By the time the longboat's keel scraped and juddered on the pebbles, the dragons had gone to ground on the city's wall, and two dark figures moved along the top of the gatehouse. Guards there had thrown spears once. The broken, sea-polished hafts lay along the stones like driftwood. The dragon queen waited where the river met the sea. She wore a pale dress that gathered the first light to it, so that she seemed to bleed dawn from her sleeves. Her hair fell like a spill of snow. Behind her stood men who did not belong together by the measure of any land. The brown men of Astapor with their spears all at one height, a narrow man with a white beard whose eyes were blue and very still, a great bear of a bearded Northman in worn mail with a face that had learned hope and forgotten it and learned it again until all three had become one expression, a Tyroshi with pearls in his beard and a smile that could have been a wound, and a little girl whose eyes measured and remembered. Victarion had expected more splendor. He had expected some show that would lend his errand the dignity Euron had stripped from it when he gave it voice. Instead, he found a woman tall and young, with a tiredness about the mouth that made Victarion's chest fill, not with pity, but with an iron sort of respect. He had seen captains with such a look after storms that should have drowned them and had not. She raised her hand and her dragons lifted their heads upon the wall as if she moved their necks with strings. "Captain," she said. Her tongue fitted the common with the care of one who has practiced. "You bring the sea to a city that would rather not know it." Victarion's men grounded the boat and sprang out. Pebbles rolled underfoot like bones. He splashed ashore and stood before her, close enough to see a pale scar along her wrist where it ran out from under her sleeve and dived back again. He went to one knee. He did not bow his head. "I bring ships," he said, "and iron." "You are iron-born," said the white-bearded man softly. "I am Victarion Greyjoy, Lord Captain of the Iron Fleet." He rose. "My ships have eaten many ships. If this city had dared send its boats out to meet me, it would have no boats left. It seems your dragons frightened them into their harbors." "My dragons frighten many things," the young queen said. The faintest smile touched her mouth and went away. "They do not frighten me. They will frighten my enemies," Victarion replied. "And that is enough." He lifted one hand. It was not his habit to make open shows of anything other than strength, but the night wanted an oath, and he gave it a crude shape. "I was sent east with a purpose. I choose to change it. I offer you my ships for your use. Your enemies are my enemies until you have crossed the sea." The Northman stiffened fractionally at that. The white beard shifted as if to speak. The queen lifted her hand, and neither of them moved. "Crossed which sea?" she asked. Victarion looked at the river, the city, the gray light that pushed back the night upon the waves. "The only one," he said, and tasted the word that men in the halls of Pike made sport of. "Westeros." The wind blew a curl of her hair against her cheek. She did not brush it away. For a long moment she looked past Victarion, over his shoulder and the crescent of his fleet beyond him. The small dragon, green and pale like a morning coin, shifted upon the wall, and its talons made a soft squeal of stone. "When I look back, I am lost," she said as if to herself. I have said it often. I have tried not to look back. Yet I cannot help but think of the men who followed me here. I freed them and told them to be free. I do not own them, yet I carry their eyes like stones in my skirt. They can pray thanks to their gods on their knees here as well as upon a ship, said the Tyroshi with the pearls. He smiled at Victarion as if they shared some jest. The sea and I are friends, sweet queen. I have long suggested. You are not a friend, the Northman interrupted in a voice like gravel. You are a sellsword, and you said last night that you preferred wine when it was good, and war when it was profitable. Yora, the little girl said without looking at him. The queen is thinking. Arstan, the queen said gently, and the white-bearded man's eyes flicked to her. What say you? That a queen's first duty is to her people, Arstan said. His voice was soft, the common pure upon his tongue. Yet a queen must also become what the world needs. You did not cross a sea to become a brick queen of a slave city. You are Daenerys of House Targaryen. Sometimes grass remembers hooves, and sometimes a city is a pasture that promises no foal. The dragons shifted again. The larger one on the wall fixed Victarion with a pupil like a door hung ajar in a black house. Heat came off its breath in slow gusts. Victarion felt the old wound sing along his arm. He did not look away. Victarion Greyjoy, the queen said, bringing her gaze back to his face. Your brother sent you to fetch me as a hound is sent to fetch a hare. I know this. Will you say you come to fetch me still? I come to carry you, Victarion said simply, and found he meant it exactly, without pride. Not to take you, not to chain you to any man, carry you over cold water to your own land. The sea is a road. I will be your road. The Tyroshi glanced at the little girl and smirked again. The Northman said nothing, and the white-bearded man watched his queen as if all the air in the bay belonged to her breath. The young woman stood very still, and in that stillness Victarion felt for the first time the size of the thing he had drifted toward in his sleep since Euron's command. In the slakes of midnight, on the benches of his ships, he had dreamed of crows, of a screaming horn, of a woman who stood in a black gate with fire under her skin. Now she stood upon the smear of dirty sand that separated a river from a sea, and the only fire visible was in her eyes. Very well, she said. Let us see if your road is strong enough for dragons. There is a taste that the sea takes from any ship it carries, and the Iron Fleet, for all its iron, had its share of it. Pitch in the tongue, iron in the teeth, the sourness of men's sweat hammered by wind into the very back of the throat. Daenerys learned that taste during the first 2 days. She learned how to count sleeps by the creak that came from the mainmast each time the ships breathed, how to feel the change of the wind in her scalp before a sailor shouted for a brace to be hauled, how to step between oarlocks without earning bruises like coins upon her hip. She learned that on iron-born ships the men knelt to no idol but the sea, and that they touched the water with their fingers as if it were a woman's cheek. Some were tattooed with waves, some with rocks and ropes, some with wives' names that had been changed to other names with knife cuts. None looked away from her when she came among them. Their eyes were as direct as hunger. Grey Worm did not like their eyes. He moved among them like a winter shadow, noting everything and seeming to forget nothing. On the second day, a sailor from a longship called Night Whale put his hand on the arm of a girl from Astapor who had been given leave to bring bread to the foredeck. Grey Worm reached the sailor before the hand's tips had learned the shape of the bone. There was no blood, unsullied moved like needles, but something in the sailor's wrist cracked like old ice, and he held it afterward like a solemn oath he had broken. They took him below and bound the wrist. He did not go near the girl again. Missandei did not keep to the cabin the Ironborn had given her, though she could have. She came up each morning and learned the Ironborn words for things while the sun shook itself free of cloud. Arstan Whitebeard sat by the quarterdeck, where he could watch Daenerys and the helmsman both, and told her stories of old sails, of the Valyrian holds and the fast-oared boats that had flocked to them like gulls, of the spice ships of Far Et with their sails as soft as women's clothes. He did not speak of Westeros unless she asked him to, and she did not ask often. When she did, she tasted the words slowly in her mouth until it seemed less like a place and more like a hunger that men had named, and fed, and never grown full upon. Yora watched everything and said little. She knew the shape of his silence the way one knows a road traveled by night. The stones change, the ruts deepen or are filled with rain, but the road is the same. In his silence she felt the weight of ships he did not trust and men he did not like. Once, on the third day, when the sky had lifted to show a ragged strip of blue and her small dragon took it into himself by opening his wings and drinking the air, she turned to Yora and said, "Tell me what you fear." "I fear that iron men serve only iron," he said. "They follow the weight of it. There are heavier things than iron in Westeros." "Dragons weigh more," she said. "They burn different," he answered. At night, when the sea lay stretched like beaten metal and the stars were small fires hammered into it at the whim of a god with a long nail, Daenerys went forward to where the bow climbed and fell upon the swell and looked back along her ship. The Ironborn had given her the largest of their flagships, and even so the dragons were too much for it. The large one, Drogon, claimed the stern castle as if born to the timber. He liked to lie with his wings half spread, a black shadow that moved though the wind was steady. When he moved, the ship's stern itself seemed to shift, as if the iron nails had become soft. The two smaller ones, Regal and Viserion, had taken to the main and fore masts. Sailors complained that their talons scored the grain. Makoro laughed and told them that dragons sharpened wood to make it sing in a storm. Makoro came to her one night when sleep had left her. The Red Priest moved like the night's own flame, slow and sure, and sat with his braids making a faint rattle as the ship rose and fell. He looked out to sea when he spoke to her, as if the water were the face that demanded heed. "Before dawn," he said, "the wind will change, and there will be a dream on it." "You dream of fire," she said, because his eyes were crowded with it. "I dream of what fire shows," he answered. "Tonight it shows 3 birds falling out of a pale sky and striking water as if the water were a plate. When they rise, they do not rise as birds. Their wings are heavy and their cry is iron. You speak in riddles. I speak the tongue of the thing that burns," he said, gentle as a lullaby. "It pleases riddles. It likes to see men's thoughts move like fish below a boat. Let them move, queen. They will not be caught tonight. Only remember that the horn a crow brought from Valyria will kill the man who blows it, and bind what he hoped to bind. If you hear it, do not mistake the power for the hand that holds it." She looked at him in the shadow, at the half-seen curl of his mouth. "I will not blow any horn he gave me," she said. Makoro's teeth shone. "Nor let another for your sake," he said softly, and left her with the stars and the slow music of cordage. The storm took them on the 5th day and taught Daenerys the taste of her own name when it was dragged backwards over her teeth. The sky let down its weight in sheets and the sea rose in green glass walls that shattered along the ship's flanks. The helmsman's shout was chewed to pieces by the wind, but the ship understood him. It came off the top of one wave like a breaking thing and met the next with its ribs and did not break. Men climbed as if the rigging were ladders in a burning tower. Twice she saw a sailor cut free a sail that had become a wet fist, and twice she saw it snatched out of his hand by a wind that had more hands than men had. Once the bow dove until the sea shoved its lips over the deck and all the lanterns went out at once. She heard Drogon before she saw him. The great tearing savage joy of his roar ripped open by thunder and throttled and thrown back again. He came off the stern in a spray of black water and vanished into the storm and came again, closer, so that she felt his wind and the hot pebbled skin of his belly was a night all its own. Regal and Viserion clung to the masts, their long bodies whipping like pennons. When a masthead lantern loosed its hook and smashed, Viserion breathed, and the slant of rain was briefly an orange curtain. Victarion on the quarterdeck stood as if someone had planted him there. His legs welded, his broad face wet and blank. A man fell near him, slid, struck the rail. Victarion's hand moved as if it had always belonged upon that man's belt, and he hauled him back as one lifts a net with a fish and throws both down again. The priest stood with him, eyes open to rain. The horn lay in its iron cradle by the mast, an ugly twist of metal inscribed with bands of Valyrian glyphs that made the eye want to look sideways. Twice a sailor's glance brushed it and did not return. Victarion looked at it also, and something in him leaned towards it as a man leans toward a sword he has used well. Then Makoro made a small sound in his throat that was not words, and Victarion's jaw set and he moved his gaze to the water and did not move it again. When dawn came, the sea was a field of hammered pewter. The sails hung in long wet rags, then filled as the wind took them back. Men slumped at their tasks and blinked salt from raw lids. Dragons slept with wings loose, like children after weeping. The sky was the pallor of a pearl. Daenerys stood by the prow with her hair twisted and heavy with Yora came and said, "We hold our course. My road is strong enough for dragons," she said, thinking of Victarion's words, and the small smile that stole across her mouth then felt strange there and very old. They came upon the bone way of water that men named the Stepstones, and beyond those lapped the green of the narrow sea. On the 8th day, bird cries changed, no longer the long thin call of sea birds, but the coarse scold of coastal things. The wind brought earth. It brought time and dust and the hot breath of stone. Missandei wept without seeming to know it. When Daenerys touched her cheek, she laughed and said, "The land is crying because we are coming." They made land near Planky Town, where the green blood of the river slid between reeds and villages on wood. The Dornish galleys came like dark knives along that green water, oars flashing in neat unison, the banners from their sterns soft in the heat. Spears glittered. On the quay, the people had gathered as they always gather when anything happens to the world. Half in fear, half in hope, wholly wanting to be able to say, "I was there when." Hoda had seen kings arrive and kings die, and he had learned that both things looked more ordinary when they came than the stories made them afterward. He stood behind his prince with his long axe in the slant of shade cast by the Tower of the Sun and watched a girl with pale hair step from a warship. The sun caught in that hair and made a white flash. The crowd sighed as if a cloud had passed and given back their warmth. She walked like a rider. I measured the men who walked with her. The big Northman with the face of an honest axeman. The pale-bearded man with the old hands and the clear eyes that watched what they did not look at. The little scribe girl with ink-stained fingers and a spine straighter than many men's. The silent rows of spearmen whose shields were as square as the steps of a stair. The Sellsword with pearls who dipped his head as if to drink the light, and many still who were not that. And there were 3 shadows behind her which the sun did not know how to strike, and when they moved all other things made space for them without thinking. Hoda had seen elephants, and he had felt earth shudder beneath lumbering magnificence. These were not that. These were knives that were all edge. Prince Doran sat beneath a canopy, his gout-swollen foot set upon a cushion. He lifted both hands as the girl drew near and smiled the slow smile that soothed as surely as a palm upon a fevered brow. "The blood of the dragon," he said, and his voice went out over the river and the crowd like a cool bell. "Welcome to Dorne." Daenerys bent her head. She did not kneel. "Your Grace," she said. "Not Grace," the prince said. "We keep our crowns as other men keep old letters. We look at them sometimes and remember who wrote to us. I will be prince until I am dust. You will be queen so long as the world remembers your name." "My name is Daenerys," she said, and the crowd said it back to her as if tasting a new fruit. Arianne wore a thin white silk and no jewels. The heat lay over Sunspear like a hand. The silk did nothing to move that hand aside. Even so, she watched the Dragon Queen without blinking. The woman was younger than she had expected, younger and harder in the eye than Arianne had hoped, and her mouth did something when she paused between words that told Arianne she had learned to set her teeth upon her tongue. Arianne had bitten her tongue often. "You have crossed the desert that is the sea," she said after the prince had spoken. "Come into shade." In the shade of the tower they gave the queen a cup of cool water scented with lime and a plate of apricots. She ate one and placed the stone on the plate as if it were a small debt she meant to honor later. "I have dreamed of this land," she said, holding the second apricot to her bottom lip and not yet tasting it. "I have dreamed of towers that are older than my life and of sand that speaks when the wind moves upon it." "Dorne speaks to those who listen," Arianne said. "I mean to hear all the lands," the queen answered, and ate the second apricot. Quentyn had been sent to fetch a dragon bride. He had been sent to cross deserts and seek a woman whose name made men's tongues hot. Now he sat with his hands upon his knees, looking at his father's face and not at the girl standing within the frame of the doorway who had unhooked her hair and let it fall along her back, and he listened as Prince Doran said, "You have come with iron ships. Will iron stay when fire comes?" "They stay," said Victarion Greyjoy, who stood bluntly near the doorway, a piece of tide brought into a room by accident, "until they sink." He had forced the iron of the ships into the stone place and did not know where to put it. The red priest at his shoulder watched the prince's hands and the flicker of the lanterns and the line of sunlight along the floor, as if each were a sentence in some language the rest did not know. "We will stand you in our harbor," Doran said. "We will take your oath who brought her, and the oath of she who came. I have planned long for a Targaryen in Dorne." He looked down at his foot and then up again. "Long plans seldom survive the day they are meant for. Help me make this one a living creature." "I do not come as a parcel," Daenerys said, and the very slightest of smiles touched the prince's mouth. "No," he said, "you come as a storm." Cersei Lannister was not sleeping when the raven came down by night to Maegor's holdfast, though the city slept and the river wore a film of dull starlight that made it look dead. She had fallen out of the habit of sleep. It was easier to drink and dream while waking. Dreams survived better that way. The raven gave her 2 messages. One from Old Town, where the Hightower's owls had blinked and said that a fisher in the arbor had seen a black shape against the moon and lost his nets. One from Dorne that said something else entirely in fewer words, a language that only the stomach understood, in which the word dragon had more syllables than letters and smelled of old smoke. Qyburn read them aloud with his little cough. "It seems there is a new force moving," he said delicately. "Everything moves," Cersei said. She had the window shutters thrown wide. She let the river smell in because it kept the smell of her father's death chamber from inhabiting her nose when she was tired. "Send men to the sept to pray if prayer is the fashion. Send gold to the kettlebellies of the city and meat to their pots. Send a message to the Lord of the Rock and tell him that his grace holds her walls. And send word to the Lord with the black ships that he is to prove worthy of the king he has. The Lord with the black ships will read what we write to him and use it to light his pipe," Qyburn said, smiling a little. "Ironborn are like that." "Then send a message to the Red Keep's cooks and tell them to spice their pigs better," Cersei said, because when the river smell had breath enough it made her think of pig guts, and she would not be made to think of pig guts by any river. "If dragons come to King's Landing, I will have a feast prepared." She laughed a thin little laugh, and Qyburn, who had learned how to love her laughter when it lied, laughed, too. When he had gone, she stood by the window and put her hands upon the stone sill until her palms hurt. In the glass beyond her face there floated a pale oval where the moon had died. Cersei lifted her own hand and saw it as if it belonged to a woman older than she was, though she was not old. The hand trembled. She closed it into a fist and it did not tremble. In the Stormlands, a young man who called himself Aegon held a map down with his long fingers and listened to a murmur of rain upon canvas. Jon Connington watched him. The boy had begun to look at maps as if they were living things that could be stroked and soothed. He traced the coast from Storm's End down to Dorne and paused at the river called the Greenblood. "If she has truly come," he said, "then half the lords we mean to win will sit down upon their hands and count their banners. Some would hoist them to her rather than me." "You are the rightful king," Jon Connington said. The words were a rung he had climbed so many times that they held the shape of his hands. "And yet if the people look up and see my aunt riding the sky," the boy said softly, "they will forget all rungs and look at the sky. A dragon is a ladder with fire for steps." "You are not without fire," said Jon Connington, and felt the old pain flecks where the grayscales bite lay sleeping. "You have a better claim and a better tutor." The boy looked up and smiled in the way he had begun to smile, half to please and half to hide. "We will see what she is," he said. "Perhaps she has a better tutor than you." In Sunspear they brought Daenerys up through the gardens where pools burned with the light of noon, though noon was already over. She took off her sandals and walked with the water touching her ankles, shallow and flat and warm as breath. Children peeped from behind columns to see if her hair was true. A little boy darted out like a fish and touched the end of one pale lock with 2 fingers and fled. She smiled and let the water take the heat out of the stone of her feet and tried to think as a queen and not as a girl who had once had nothing but a stone house and an older brother and a terror of men with hard hands. Arion joined her by one pool where a fig tree spread its hands and let them shade the water. "Dorne hates chains," she said. "We will not ask you to wear any." "Your father speaks softly," Daenerys said. Arion laughed with her whole mouth. "Wolves speak softly when they wait. Dornishmen wait a long time. We watched your father's father roast a lord in his armor, and we said nothing that could be used to kill our sons. We watched Robert kill your father, and we said nothing that could be used to kill our daughters. We built long plans. It is a thing we can do. But sometimes the wind comes and throws long plans into the fountain." She lifted her hand and scattered drops into the air. Each was a coin that came down where it would. "You are a wind, Daenerys. It is good to be a wind. It is also hard to be a wind, because winds do not sleep and they do not stay where they are put. I have slept in tents and on the ground and on the deck of a ship," Daenerys said. "I have not slept in any place the world would let me keep. I would like to sleep in a place once and wake up again and know the walls were mine." "Walls keep in and keep out," Arion said. "When the time comes to move, you will hate them. Then I will knock them down," Daenerys said, and liked the sound of it because it was childish and honest, and for a heartbeat she wanted the world to be simple enough to obey it. By night in Sunspear the wind came down from the hills with the smell of rosemary on it and made the hanging lanterns sway in their niches. And men leaned in close to speak and women laughed with their heads thrown back. Victarion Greyjoy did not go to the feast that had been spread for the queen. He stayed by the dark water of the Greenblood and stared at his ships as if they were beasts he had loosed and now must coax back into their stalls. The horn lay in a chest aboard the Iron Victory. Sometimes he could feel it from the quay where he stood, as one feels a bad tooth in a jaw. He had a wife once, brown and willful, whom he had beaten to death with his hands because a song in the Iron Islands had taught him that a man who could not tame his household could not tame the sea. He did not regret her. He regretted nothing that he had done in anger, only what he had done for his brother. He remembered the crow's eye smile and his gifts like fishhooks. He spat into the green water and watched his spit lie upon it like oil. Then he lifted his head because he had heard, above the river's slide and the night noise, a sound like a breath drawn sharply. The dragons were awake in the dark. He could not see them, but the hairs on his forearms rose to meet the thought of their eyes. Moqorro appeared at his side like a thought given flesh. "You bring yourself into the night," the priest said. "It is a good habit." "I watch my ships," Victarion said. "You watch the thing that carries you," Moqorro murmured. "A wise man watches also the thing he carries." "I carry a queen," Victarion said flatly. "You carry a war," said the priest, and his braids whispered. In the days that followed, the green blood of the river learned names it had not known. The Unsullied drilled on the long sand spits, their shields meeting the sun like a choir of mirrors. Dornish spearmen drilled beside them and learned to relax their shoulders to the square weight of the Astapori shields. Riders from V's Duthrak stared at the water until it made them sick and then learned to stare past it at the horse-colored hills. Lords came to Sunspear with banners, and soft somebodies in their halls spoke of oaths and old wrongs and what was owed to dragons and to the Prince of Dorne and to a dead boy named Elia's son who was not dead but murdered, and murdered twice. Once by a mountain with a knife, once by the silence that followed the first murder. The silence had lasted years. Men hung their new banners on it now as if it were a wall made for banners. Ser Barristan Selmy stood by a half-open arch and watched the Dornish move like dancers within the pattern of their courtyards. He said little. One evening he came to Daenerys while she put her hair up herself in the Dornish fashion and said, "There are whispers out of the reach. The lords Tyrell water their gardens with spies. They will not want dragons near Old Town's book towers." "I do not intend to roost on their towers," Daenerys said. "I intend to take the throne of my fathers and give Westeros a queen who will not burn men for speaking truly, nor let monsters serve her when they should die. Men will call it burning, Barristan said quietly. "When dragons are fed." She turned and looked at him, really looked as she did not always, because he was so often correct that his rightness had become a part of the furniture of her days. "Ser Arstan," she said, and the old lie seemed smaller now than it had been when he first came to her in salt-smelling Karth. "If I gave my dragons to the sea tonight, would the world love me better?" "It would not love you at all," Barristan said. "It would forget you, and not forgives, for forgetting is a different sin." He bowed his white head. "Forgive that I speak when not bidden." "I bid it," she said, "every day that I draw breath." Missandei brought her figs in a bowl and lifted each peel with the elegance of a girl who had learned how to offer food without offering anything else. "The prince sends," she said, "and the princess sends." Daenerys ate a fig and thought of the way Arianne had laughed and the way Doran had smiled and the way Quentyn had sat with his hands like little anchors on his knees and said almost nothing. It was a game of silences and fruits. She had played poorer games. Word walked along roads and rode rivers and the old tracks across the hills where goats had made a stubborn web long before men. It moved over passes and across the grass of the marches where little keeps stood like toothed stumps and counted days. In King's Landing it became talk in wine-houses and a prayer to the mother and a mutter in the ears of goldcloaks who had fathers in the riverlands. In Old Town it ran along the quays and climbed the steps of the citadel as if they were the back of a coiled dragon. Acolytes prized seals from old scrolls that spoke of wildfires laid by Ares and chains made of iron and gold and bronze that wept green when the fog came in. In the Stormlands it turned men's cloaks their fathers' colors and sharpened old chevrons. In the north it was only a breeze that made ravens cock their heads toward south and then tuck them back beneath wing. Jon Snow stood upon the wall and watched the world change its light each hour, and when the news came to him that a queen with dragons had landed in Dorne, he did not smile or frown. He had learned that any new thing under the sun darkened something else. The wind went round his face with its knives. The wall itself breathed like a great cold beast. "We keep our own watch," he said. It was almost a prayer now, almost a song that men in black learned to sing in their bones until their bones did the singing without their leave. "We keep our watch and let kings keep theirs. Maybe this queen will be different," one boy said softly, and Jon turned his head and looked at him until the boy looked out at the snow again and left his hope where it could not be knocked from his hand. In Sunspear the plans thickened and thinned with the days. Victarion gave over 3 more ships into Dornish hands so they might learn how their oarsmen worked, and in return he took 100 spears aboard as passengers and stood them along his deck and watched the way they filled his space with their calm stillness. He smelled their oil and their leather, and he watched the dragons watch them. Drogon had begun to take short flights each morning over the dunes, skating the air with his wings and hurling his shadow ahead as if he wished to see how the whole land would look if it were his. Sometimes he went so high that his shadow grew faint and the sand forgot it. Then he came down in a long hurtling curve, and the Unsullied lifted their spear points and set their feet, and every man upon the quay forgot to breathe. He did not strike them. He drank the salt out of the air with his huge lungs and screamed his claim at the sun, and the sound scraped the sky like a nail. Daenerys stood with Arianne and Doran and Quentyn in a map room where the world had been painted upon a table that had once belonged to a dead man with a long name and a long patience for shaping wood. She set her hands upon the painted coast and felt the table's heart. "We cannot go upon King's Landing first," she said. "The Blackwater is too well held. We will ride the Stormlands. They are a field whose fences are broken, and the Reach will not move until it must." "The Stormlands will cut you," Doran warned. "With little knives called lords who remember Robert Baratheon breaking your father and making them kings by giving them nothing." "I will give them something," Daenerys said. "Peace afterward. Justice that means the same thing for a knight as for a child. Roads. Bread not baked in ovens that belong to men with rings upon their fingers. I will give them an end to fear of men who come in the night calling themselves king's men or freeriders." She looked up and her eyes were of the sort that hold a reflection and do not show the thing itself. "I will give them me, and if that is not enough, I will give them fire." Barristan was very still. "We may find that it is the same gift twice," he said. Arianne traced a line along the marches with one finger and said, A queen's army needs food. The Stormlands can feed you if the Tyrells do not burn them. The Tyrells may burn them. Daenerys nodded. The figs were sweet enough to make her tongue think of summer, and that was dangerous. Then we will go quickly. Victarion, how soon can your ships be ready to carry men to the mouth of the Wendwater and the Mander both? Victarion grunted. We can be anywhere the sea is in 7 days if the wind is right. Then find me the wind, Daenerys said, and did not look at the red priest who smiled by the window where the light fell like honey upon his hands. When the horn sounded, it sounded in a dream, and for a heartbeat every man who heard it believed that he had dreamed it before. It was a sound older than the words men had learned to shackle sounds with. It came the way a storm comes over water, without shape and yet full of shape, without edges and yet able to cut. Men fell to their knees with their hands upon their ears and bled from their noses and cried without knowing why. Birds launched raggedly from the walls and flailed in air as if the air had become thick. Daenerys was in the garden when it came, and she lifted her head and felt something in her breast reach towards the sound like a child whose mother has come into a room. "No," she said aloud to no one and began to run. The world had a white rim around it, and she did not remember stairs, only the fact that she was suddenly upon the quay and men were writhing as if worms had been poured into their ears, and the horn sound rode the river like a second river. It came from the iron Victory, from the chest where the ugly twist of metal lay in its iron cradle. Victarion had not blown it. He stood on the deck with his hands open and his face more rigid than any she had ever seen. A man lay at his feet, a man Daenerys did not know, an Ironborn whom she would not now come to know. The man's lips were bleeding and his eyes were open and the color had run out of them. Smoke rose from a hole in his chest as if some coal had been laid there, and being a coal did what it had to do. Moqorro stood beside the body with his hands lifted and his eyes alight, not with joy but with something colder. He turned his head slowly to look at Daenerys as she came aboard. "I told you," he said softly, "the hand that holds it dies. But the thing he hoped to hold will come." The dragons came out of the sky as if the sky were a curtain that had been pulled and revealed them. Regal and Viserion dropped like silver and green stones into the river's light and smashed the air with their wings and seized the mainmast and the foremast of the Iron Victory at once. Drogon did not come down. He hung above the ship with his wings beating and his long throat drawn taut like a bowstring. The horn's last long shout made a shiver run along his body as if it were a harp. Then the sound was gone, and the world was filled with the sound of men who had not yet learned how to hear again. Drogon opened his mouth and smoke roped out and went away. He hung and looked down, and the yellow of his eyes was like a dawn that had learned to see. Slowly, as if the airs were treacherous and it would not be wise to trust them with any sudden movement, he lowered himself until he stood with a crash of his weight along the stern and his claws bit into the carved seahorse there, which screamed under him. He looked at Daenerys. Then he moved his golden gaze to Victarion, and his head tilted and opened a little like a question. Daenerys felt the horn gift try to lay its hands upon her as the river tried to lay its hands upon a man who did not know the trick of swimming, and she pushed back. She went toward Drogon because there was nothing else that would satisfy this moment. Men's hands reached for her, then hung back like dogs who knew when a bitch had teeth. She climbed the broken ladder at the stern and went up to where he waited and set her hand upon his neck and felt the burning there that was not heat so much as life grown too much for flesh. He turned his head the merest fraction and touched his muzzle to her shoulder, as he had so long ago, as he had always. "I am not a horn," she said to him and to the men and to the river and to the memory of any brother who had ever given a gift that was cruelty in some other tongue. "I am not a chain. I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen. The wind does not rule me." The Ironborn on deck began to get to their feet. Victarion stood with his hands closed now, not open. He looked at Moqorro the way a man looks at a snake that has given him a thing he wanted and then demanded its price. "The man was warned," Moqorro murmured, as if the words were a prayer and an excuse both. Victarion's mouth made a shape that gave back no sound. Daenerys lifted her hand from Drogon and looked at the black twist of the horn where it lay upon the deck, and for a heartbeat she had a vision as clear as the line of a spear. A great hall, and a man with a black patch over one eye and a smile like a cut, and beyond him the edge of the world with the sea falling over it into nothing. She blinked and it went away. She breathed and it did not return. "Throw it into the deepest water you have," she said, and when some flinched she turned her head, and there was something in her look that many men had obeyed before they had learned its name. "Now!" Victarion nodded once and barked words in the harsh salt tongue of his people. The Ironborn lifted the thing with long tongs, as if it were a coal spider that might scuttle up the iron and into their arms. They carried it to the rail and let it fall. It vanished without splash or cry, as if the sea had been hungry for it and took it like a drop of itself. Men breathed out as if they had been holding breath since the world was new. In King's Landing the bell of the Great September tolled for some saint with a story of barley and mercy, and men bowed their heads and thought of their own small kinds of mercy. In Old Town a novice ran down a stair with a book under his arm and fell and split his lip and bled upon the page where the old maester had written of wildfires set in cellars that had never been found. In the Stormlands, the boy who called himself Aegon looked up at the same sky that had held the horn sound and said, very quietly, "We will send to her, not to bend the knee, to ask." A king can ask a queen for a meeting. On the wall Jon Snow watched a gray bird fly to south and made himself not think of what it went to. "Words," he said aloud, though no one had asked him anything. "Words and fires. We keep our watch." In Sunspear they made oaths with wine and salt and steel. Aerion stood and bound a ribbon that had the prince's colors round Daenerys' wrist, and then round her own, and then cut it with a small knife and tucked a piece into her bodice and let Daenerys take the other. "This is a game," Aerion said under the noise of the hall. "That men think we play with our hands. It is played with the whole body. Keep yours well." "I will keep yours as well as mine," Daenerys said, and felt the ribbon like a cool hand on her hot skin. Victarion stood apart, as Iron Men do. He looked toward the sea every time a door opened. He thought of his brother in his tall chair upon the sea stone, and of the way Euron had of knowing when a man's thoughts had turned against him while that man was yet smiling. He thought of war upon green waves and war upon green fields. He thought of dragons winging low over wheat. He thought of what iron does to bone. He thought of what fire does to iron. He thought, unexpectedly and without liking it, of mercy. When morning came again, the city smelled of pomegranates and horses and the clean sweat of men who had trained hard. Missandei woke in the little chamber that had been given her and lay very still and listened to the house make its small, busy noises. She thought of the way Daenerys had stood against the horn and had not been moved. She thought of the way the Ironborn, those who had learned only to take what they wanted by hurting, had obeyed without argument when she asked them to give something back to the water. She thought, and then she got up and set herself to a day of work, because thinking was a kind of food, but not the sort that kept men upright. The first sails lifted that afternoon like wings along the green mouth of the river. The Iron Fleet and the Dornish galleys went out upon the bright water together, and the city lined the walls and the piers to watch. Above, a dragon wheeled and drew his shadow along the river like a sword. Daenerys stood upon the deck in the wind and did not hold the rail. She did not need to. The wind took her hair and made it a flag, and she let it, because flags were a sort of promise and she meant to keep the ones she could. Behind her Barristan stood like a white tree, and beside him Jorah wore his old hope with the grimness that made it bearable. Before her the river ran to the sea and the sea to the places that were her future. They left Sunspear with the taste of apricot upon their tongues and the memory of ribbons upon their wrists. The iron sound of oars met the steady hiss of water along hulls, and somewhere on the dunes a child shouted a name that the wind lifted and stretched until it was only sound. The fleet turned its prows to the west and south, where the Stormlands kept their knives and hedgerows and the Reach hid its bread behind rose-covered walls, and the world held its breath a little. Daenerys set her face to the wind and let it strike it clean. The coast unreeled like a ribbon beneath her. The sea spoke the words it had learned in some older language, and far ahead, beyond promontories and marshes and the green ring of islands that men had named easy names so that children might remember them, a city waited that she had dreamed of without seeing. She did not look back. She did not let herself. If she was lost, she would be lost going forward. The dragons flew and fell and rose again, drawing lines across the sky that meant nothing and everything to those who watched from below. "Your road is strong enough," she said under her breath. Whether to the Iron Captain or to the sea or to herself, she could not have said. "Let us see where it goes." The coast drew itself like a slow blade along the starboard side, black at first, then green when the dawn took color again. The dunes ceased, and low cliffs shouldered their way out of the sea with scrub clinging to them in tattered shawls. The smell changed. Dorne fell away behind them with its rosemary and sun-baked stone, and the stormlands crept under the wind with a new breath, wet oak and moss and the sour copper of old rain. Daenerys stood with her bare feet braced upon oak that had crossed 3 seas and felt the change in the ship's bones as surely as in the air. The oars were shipped, the sails shouldered the morning like beasts eager to be loosed, and the fleet took the sea in a line that was not quite a line, for the Ironborn would have their own ways even when they sailed for her. Victarion gave the wind a hard look as if it were another captain that had to be bullied into obedience. "Wrath takes men by the chin here," he said without turning. "It will slap you to see if you'll cry or bite. Bite, and it respects you." "I have bit," Daenerys said lightly. He grunted approval as if he had taught the world its first useful trick. Drogon's shadow went over them, long and neat. Regal and Viserion rose slower on morning stiffness, wings rowing the cool. On the quarterdeck Makoro watched them and let his eyes half close, and the brazier beside him burned a different color in the dawn, blue in its heart as if it had remembered another sky. Grey Worm stood nearby, indifferent to omens, content to measure distances with the set of his shoulders and the weight of spear in hand. Barristan Selmy came to her with lines around his eyes that had not been there yesterday. "I know this coast," he said simply, and she heard the lost music in the words. "From Shipbreaker to Tarth and back again. It has a hunger. It eats wrecks and boasts both." "Did you boast here?" she asked, teasing old grief with gentleness. "I am a knight of House Selmy," he said, and a little of the pride that never died under all the ash came alive for a breath. "We boasted everywhere." Yora stood watch on the lee side, speaking low with Ariohota and a Dornish pilot who knew the mouth of the Wendwater by feel. It had rained in the night. The decks were still tender with it, and the rigging ticked as it dried, long patient plucks of string. Missandei held a wax tablet and copied the pilot's crooked little map with neat care, her tongue between her teeth as if to keep words from escaping while she worked. They made landfall not with horns and banners but with fishermen staring and backing away and crossing themselves with the 7 sign and a little boy dropping his crab pot into the shallows, so that its rope paid out in a pale line across the water like a lifeline that had forgotten its business. The Iron Victory lay off in the roadstead like a patient black animal, and the Dornish galleys took the inner anchorage with the insolent grace of knives placed in velvet. Weeping Town had a handful of wet roofs and a sept that leaned as if the wind had shouldered it for years. The bell there was small and had a forlorn voice. It heard the dragons before it saw their shadows and began to ring itself like a frightened bird. Daenerys went ashore with a half-company of Unsullied, Ser Barristan in white steel, Yora in travel-worn mail, and 3 Dornish lords with their badges, a muddle of suns and spears and coiled vipers. Arianne was not with them. She had ridden inland at dawn with 5 of Dorne's quicker tongues to find ears that might wish to hear what the wind brought. The quay stones were slick. A woman dropped to both knees before Daenerys with her hands spread and her face turned up as if to catch rain. She was no older than Daenerys had been when Viserys sold her for a crown and a horse and a promise, and she had a child on her hip who did not cry. Daenerys reached and lifted the woman by the wrist, and the woman shook and then stilled and stood in a daze. "I am not your saint or your god," Daenerys said softly to the air so that anyone might hear and all might pretend not to. "I am only a woman with 3 dragons and a purpose." "A queen," the Septon said from the steps where he had paused with his broom in his hand and his mouth open. He was an old man with a face soft as bread. "The father watches. The mother weeps to see her child so far from home." He blinked and then hurried down and would have thrown himself at her feet, but Barristan moved and the old man stopped with a sense of the rightness of old habit. "Forgive," he stammered. Forgive an old man who has only the right words when no one is listening. Be at peace, Daenerys told him. She wanted to put her hand upon his head the way she had set a hand upon Drogon's neck, the same blessing for a different sort of fear, but the Septon's eyes were already glossing with tears. The bell above them stopped its nervous talking and let the sea have the sound again. Victarion would have preferred a landing with iron and ash. He looked at the village and saw good timbers for oars and hulls, and that was that. Yet even his hard gaze softened the fractional part of a fraction when the small dragon folded itself upon the sept roof and lay as if charmed, its tail making a slow, satisfied S. They cannot send ravens fast enough if the bird is already above their houses, he said. Good, let them talk. We are a thing best carried in other men's mouths. Words will fly, Ser Barristan said, and men's hearts with them. I would hear what song they are taught to sing. They sent riders out under truce bands. The banners were new-stitched and stiff with salt and sun and belief. Storm lords had tongues of their own and long memories. Some would spit when they tasted Targaryen. Some would be thirsty for it. The first to come were little men. Sheriffs, a hedge knight with a scar that made his smile look cruel when he was only embarrassed, 2 millers and a woman who called herself the Reeve and walked with a stick that had more authority than any badge. They came into the square of Weeping Town and made a ring of people around the ring of Unsullied in the way of small folk left to their own hard orders. They had brought bread. They had brought questions. Daenerys stood and let both be offered. It was not a speech she gave them. Speeches were for men who needed to alchemize fear into noise. She had little fear and less taste for noise. She told them, in a voice that let them see her teeth, that she had crossed an ocean to make wrong things right, that chains were no law, that a queen who could not be measured by the way she kept the weakest of her people might as well be a bandit with a prettier standard. She said that a baker who took grain for a lord's tithe and kept it for the village when the lord came drunk with swords, and a knight who set his spur on the ground and knelt to a child who could not stand because a lord's levy had taken his father's good shoes. Both were worth more than any man who called himself Castellan and broke his oaths like crusts. She said she had dragons and would use them if she must, but that she would rather not because fire was quick and justice slow, and she intended to be slow where it mattered. They listened. They nodded. The hedge knight looked away when she spoke of oaths and then forced himself to look back. The Reeve raised her stick and asked if the queen's men would pay for the bread they ate with coins rather than promises. Daenerys smiled as if she had been waiting all her life for that question. She put her hand in the little purse at her belt and paid for the bread with silver, and then emptied the purse to show that she had nothing else hidden. My men will eat what I have bought until I buy more, she said. And the next time we will eat with you, and I will hear your complaints with the taste of your bread on my tongue. The Reeve's eyes creased. She flicked her stick against the heel of her boot and made the movement that meant, we shall see. The next to come were not little men. They rode with blazons that had been sown when the world was more certain. A fox upon green, a chevron of red upon black, a tower, a stag's head without crown, a silver trout with one fin tattered where a moth had eaten the edge of the cloth. They dismounted in a row with care and stood and watched Regal's lazy regard on the sept roof and Viserions' pale gold stare along the quay. The leader was a man with the hard chin that comes from habitually biting back words. Lady Daenerys, he said, with the smallest of pauses before the honor. I am Ser Harbert Fell of Fellwood, sworn to the Storm King before there were Baratheons and after. He shrugged as if to dislodge history. I am now sworn to whoever keeps my people fed and my borders unburnt. Then you are sworn to me, Daenerys said. The Unsullied were shadows behind her, square and quiet. Or you will be when I have done. I do not ask you to forget your gods or your dead. I do not ask you to lie about your old loves. I ask you to look at your sons and daughters and choose the thing that lets them go to sleep without fear that a man with a badge will use it to beat them. Ser Harbert glanced toward Barristan's white cloak and then to the Dornishman and then to Victarion's black armor and came back to her face as if he had waded through a river and found the clean bank. He went to a knee. One knee, not both. It was not a grovel. It was a deliberate surrender of the height men keep for pride. Then I am yours, he said. and behind him the other lords hesitated and then dropped like a field of barley when the wind moves along it. Not all. The man with the silver trout held his ground and bowed only. "Lady Tully," he said when Daenerys looked to him, "Edmure is a captive and the riverlands in sore straits. I will not bend to a wind while my river runs backwards. Yet I will not take up arms against you, Queen." He tasted the word and found that it fit his mouth. "I am at peace with you while you are at peace with mine." "Keep your peace," Daenerys said. "I do not hunt trout today." She gave him a smile that did not ask him to pay for it, and he took it as men take bread when the baker's shelves are empty and he brings something out from the back. Letters moved faster than horses. Ravens rose from keep and holdfast. In Storm's End Ser Roland Storm counted his arrows as a man counts prayers and wondered if the Tyrells would grant him leave to use any of them for their true purpose if war came down from the sky. At Night Song they hung banners upon old hooks. At Tarth the Evenstar touched the hilt of a sword that had once been drawn in Aerys' hall and had gathered dust since and frowned a very little for the sake of his daughter's honor. On Griffin's Roost Jon Cunnington stood with both hands pressed flat upon the sill of a high window and watched rain sweep the valley in gray barrages. And below him the boy who called himself Aegon paced like a caged cat. The room had been new made, tapestries hung, the bed dressed in crimson. The boy ignored it all. He listened to the rain like a man listens to applause he does not trust. "We must move," he said. "If she takes the Stormlands and takes the hearts of the men who live under them, I will be the shadow of a claim." "You will be a king if you keep your head," Jon Cunnington said. "Kings do not run to greet storms. They set their feet and make the storm decide which way to go around them." "She is not a storm only," the boy said quietly. "She is my blood." He looked toward the window with the same intentness he brought to his maps. "We will send," he decided, and did not look at Jon Cunnington when he said it. "Not to bend the knee, to ask for parley. If she is wise, she will grant it. If she is a fool, I want to know it before she is my enemy." Cersei put her head down over her wine when the small council spoke of sails at Weeping Town and a dragon on a sept roof and the bells that had rung out of tune. She let the murmur run. Lord Halene the pyromancer had a voice like an old book falling into ash. He spoke of stores left from Aerys' time, of jars with the prettiest names. Qyburn watched him as cats watch birds that are used to cages and forget to be quick. Mace Tyrell preened and called for a war council that he might lead and for songs that he might ride to. "The Redwine Fleet," he began, and Cersei lifted her hand and put each finger down on the table one by one and made the fool of a man stop speaking as if she had pressed the wind out of his chest with her fingers alone. "Lord Paxter's fleet sits prudent at the Mander's mouth," she said. "Let it sit. I will not send my ships to be eaten by iron men or dragons. The girl has come to Dorne because they hate us and because Doran sits and thinks of his sister's children and of Rhaegar's harp and of his own slow blood. We will not chase a song. We will be a wall." She let her mouth make a shape that had once been a smile. "If the city is a mouth, I will fill it with meat and wine. If it is a belly, I will line it with gold. If it is a heart, I will teach it to beat when I say so. If dragons come, we will show them that King's Landing has teeth." "Wildfire," Lord Halene ventured hopefully, and she turned her head very slowly until her hair moved across her shoulder like a snake and fixed him with her look. "Teeth," she repeated, "and tongues. Send to Tarly. He loves a duty when it looks like war. Send to the Lords of the March. Show them the letters Doran wrote to Elia that we found when we took his messenger last autumn." It was not true. Qyburn had a smile behind his beard, and she felt it like a hand on her back. But her voice made it true for those who needed truth to have the queen's shape. "Tell them that the Dornish will come to burn their orchards while their sons wear other men's colors. Tell them that if they wish their daughters to sleep without fear, they must sleep in our house for a while and learn obedience. We will host them." She set down her cup. Her hand did not tremble. "And send a message to the High Septon if he has stopped being a little man and started to be God again. Tell him that a dragon has landed on a holy roof. He will know what to do with that." The High Sparrow received the message in a room that smelled of soap and wet stone. He read with his lips moving like a poor man reading a bill, and nodded and folded the parchment and set it upon the table and put a pewter cup upon it as if it might stray. "Dragons," he said. "Men used to make idols of them and call it wisdom. Perhaps wisdom is of a different weight now." He looked up at the line of ragged men waiting for bread, and then at the woman mending a girl's hem in the corner with a pin between her teeth, and shook his head. A small movement that held many things in it. "We will pray," he told the novice. "We will also teach our people that dragons breathe only smoke in a world with no wood. It is no sin to use your foot to stamp out a spark when your house is dry. Go and tell those who must be told." In Weeping Town, boys ran alongside the marching Unsullied as if beside a river that had decided to go inland just this once. The square shields lifted and settled, and the boys learned the rhythm and moved their own bodies in sympathy. Grey Worm ignored them, but a small, private corner of him marked their feet, their timing, and graded them without effort. Ser Barristan spoke to the Hedge Knight of Oaths and to the Reeve of Grain, and to Ser Harbert fell of the lay of the land. "Lady Karen at Night Song," he said, "is proud and careful. Lord Tarth will not move without honor in his pocket. Lord Buckler will look to the Tyrells until he sees that the Tyrells look to their own. And there is Connington." "Griffin," Ser Harbert said, a whetstone scrape in the word, "dead to honor and to men." "He ran," Barristan said softly. "Men die for less. He would not run again if death were in his way. He will be more dangerous for his shame." He looked out at the rain-struck forest edge. "A better tutor than I once was." He was not speaking to Daenerys then, but she heard and kept her own counsel. At dusk a rider came in soaked to the skin with a cloth held high upon his lance that was neither truce nor threat, but the old sign of parley. They brought him to Daenerys, where she took meat in the Reeve's long room, and he stood dripping on the clay floor while Missandei gave him leave to speak. "My lady," he said, because his mouth had not yet learned that queens were real things outside of books. "My prince asks audience." "Which prince?" Yora asked at once, the suspicion in him quick and healthy as a hound. "The Prince of Griffin's Roost," the rider said. He did not know how to say Aegon. It was not yet a name that fell off tongues naturally. "He says he is your brother's son." Barristan's head turned, slow as a ship's wheel. He looked at Daenerys, then away, then at the rider again. The white of his hair seemed whiter for a heartbeat. "Say what he says," Daenerys commanded, and the rider swallowed and said, "He asks to meet you in the ruins of Parchment. The place is no one's and watched by all. He says that if you are who you say you are, and he who he says he is, then there is much to speak of." "Parchment is a hunting lodge with more holes than wall," Ser Harbert said. "No keep worth the word. Good sight lines. A man would choose it if he wanted no one to think any lord had given him shelter." "Good," Daenerys said. She thought of the way Viserys had said the word brother when he was cold and hungry and wanted to blame someone for a winter that did not lift just because a prince asked it to. "Tell your prince I will meet him in 2 days. Victarion." The Iron Captain tore a hunk of bread as if it were something that bit back. "Your meeting," he said, "is a line of oak across open country. I will be your ditch and stake." He spoke 3 words in the sea's old growl, and a man went out into the rain with a horn that was only a horn and calloused palms to hold it. The Ironborn began to move with the same silence with which they had once sacked sleepy coasts. Dornish riders saddled in the same breath that they swore. The Unsullied did not change expression. Their movements had been decided 3 hours ago in the room where Grey Worm had lined pebbles upon a table and tapped each with a fingernail and deemed some acceptable and others not. They rode at dawn under rain that felt deliberate. Parchment had been a pretty thing once, with a little tower and a loggia that opened to a meadow where deer had come when the world was older and time less hunted. It sat now like a verse half remembered, the end rhyme missing. Water ran from stone like sweat. They took the high side. Victarion set his men low in the trees like boredom. Dornish eyes watched the flanks. Barristan and Yora rode with Daenerys and kept their horses' heads from stepping in broken stone. Drogon circled once and was gone into cloud like a promise deferred. They did not wait long. A party came from the west with only a handful of banners. The foremost showed a red griffin upon white. There was no golden lion, no rose, no stag. The boy at their head wore black and red and a sword the way a young man wears the first truth he has chosen to tell. He had Rhaegar's chin. Daenerys's breath caught like a hitch in cloth, not because she believed, but because memory is its own light and casts its own shadows. The man at his right hand had the haunted steadiness of a man who has done one wrong thing and set the rest of his life in order around it until it looked right from a distance. Jon Connington's eyes were the color of rain on slate. They reined their horses in facing one another across a narrow strip of broken flagstones where grass had made a slow assault. No one spoke first. The boy looked at Drogon's silhouette ghosting the cloud and then back to Daenerys as if to remind himself what was the true danger. When he spoke, he did not bluster. His voice was a little rough with too much practice and not enough sleep. "If you are my aunt," he said, "I am glad you live. If you are my brother's son," Daenerys answered, "I am glad you are not in a sack by a door." Their eyes took one another's measure like men at a list. He had been taught to make use of silence. She had learned to own it. Jon Connington's horse snorted once. Ser Barristan bowed his head the smallest fraction and then lifted it. It was as if a very old sword had been unwrapped in a room where people had forgot swords existed. "Prince," he said, "you have much of your father." "So men tell me," the boy said, a flicker of something in his mouth that might have been pain. "You have the years my father did not get. And the mistakes," Barristan said. "May you have fewer." They spoke then, not like claimants but like two stones set in a stream trying to decide how the water would split. He told her of Golden Company gold and Selsword's faith, and the way the small folk of the Stormlands had come out with gray faces to look at a banner that was not a stag and not a lion. She told him of chains in cities he had never smelled, of grass that had burned blue and white under 3 small shadows, of salt and of iron and of apricots and the way Dorne could sit longer than pain. He said he had a better claim by law. She said she had a better claim by fire. He said law was what men chose to believe. She said fire made new beliefs. "Marry?" Jon Connington said suddenly, almost harshly, as if the word were a poultice ripped free. "Marry and make the question foolish. Come together and the realm will bend rather than break." Aegon did not flinch, and Daenerys did not smile. The boy had a face made for earnestness. She had a face that had learned the futility of wishing it had been made for something else. "I will not be a pawn in any old man's remedy," she said, but her eyes did not leave the boy's. "I have been a pawn. I will be the hand that plays. I will not be swallowed," the boy said, not angry. "I have eaten my share of orders." Jon Connington's jaw worked once as if he had been struck and refused to acknowledge it. "The realm bleeds," he said. "Every day it bleeds more. Every plan we made while we hid across the sea has been overtaken by the foolishness of others. The only wisdom left is speed. Together you could be swift." Barristan looked at Daenerys, and there was something in his old eyes that had not been there since they boarded in Slaver's Bay. A look that mixed hope and alarm like wine and water. Yora watched Aegon as one watches a knife laid too close to a child. Victarion shifted in the saddle and spat into the rain as if to remind himself he had a mouth and used it for other things than swallowing other men's plans. "Swift," Daenerys said softly, and tasted the word. "A man can be swift to cut and slow to heal. I will not bind myself to a name because it wears my house's colors. Blood is not a warrant. It is a weight." She let her gaze rest on Aegon until he had to carry it as one carries a shield that has suddenly grown heavy. "We will not marry. Not now. Not upon a meadow with rain making a liar of every oath. Walk with me into the Stormlands. Take castles with me. Stand aside when I burn only what must be burned. If you can do that, perhaps you are my blood in truth. Or I will find you are not mine," Aegon said cleanly, and there was no swagger in it, only the steadiness of a boy who had been taught to hear truth even when it offended him. "Very well. We will move along 2 roads shadowing one another. We will see who walks the straighter. Send kindly letters to the same lords." Jon Connington suggested dryly, the ghost of humor moving through him like a draft. We will see which letters are hung up in halls and which used for kindling. They parted with more caution than they had come by. Aegon's party turned into the rain again and became smudges and then nothing. Daenerys did not move for a time. The meadow breathed around them, the memory of Viserys' hand on her arm, hauling, burned and then faded. "He is handsome," Yora said through his teeth, making it a fault. Barristan breathed once and did not answer. Victarion made a sound like distant thunder. "He is a boy," he said. "Boys drown in surf. Men stand. Boys also become men," Moqorro murmured, having come somehow to Daenerys' left hand without her seeing him move. "And men become less than boys when the sea makes a game of them." The fires show two swords crossing and neither breaking. They show also a woman standing between them with empty hands, and the swords are ashamed. "Does your fire show what Tarly will do?" Daenerys asked, too weary of riddles to love another. Moqorro's smile curled, secret friendly. "He will count. He will polish the coin of his honor and hold it to the light. He will think he sees his face in it and be pleased. Then he will wait behind hedges with archers because that is the face that matters more." Randyll Tarly did not think of his honor as a coin. He thought of it as a blade that, once nicked, must be rehoned and rehoned until it sang again. He gathered men at Bitterbridge and sent fast riders with orders to cut the roads and pull up bridges and kill the cows they could not take. "A dragon must eat," he told Mathis Rowan with the weary patience that one gives to clever boys who like higher sums than the plow allows. "Make it go hungry, and it will fly far from the bread it needs to burn your barns. Then send men to the barns you do not wish to lose and station them there in numbers, and with discipline the dragons will have no practice pitting themselves against." He thought also of wildfire, because men always think of magic when they are afraid of ordinary things, and he sent a quiet man to King's Landing with a sealed letter and no badge and no colors, because dragons are no dragons. Cersei was as likely to burn a man who brought her bad news as to reward him, and Randyll Tarly preferred his messengers used for more messages. The first castle the queen took was not a castle. It was a toll house on the Wendwater with a stout gate and a low wall and a corruption that made the stones weep. Men held it with swords paid for by whatever they could wring from carts. They had a license cut upon a square of oiled hide and a seal that had been good for 2 kings and 1 queen and had outlived them all. They had grown lazy. They had also grown cruel. When the Unsullied came, the toll house captain laughed because he had learned that men who moved so neatly never broke laws, and lawbreakers had more to fear from men who carried crooked knives. He laughed until Grey Worm pushed his spear through the license and pinned it to the lintel and said, in soft, careful common, "Your paper is dead." Men died who had not believed it. 2 ran to the river and drowned within sight of the far bank, their leather jacks dragging them down. 1 knelt and began to pray to a god of small bargains. Drogon came down out of a white sky and hung and screamed, and the prayer became a whimper. Daenerys did not let him burn. She did not need smoke here. She needed a clean place for carts to cross and a promise kept. She stood upon the toll house steps with the drowned men's wet hair shining like weeds behind her and told the gathered teamsters that the toll would be 1/10 and no more, and that she would take it in grain if she must and in promises never. She set the reeve's stick in a local woman's hand and said, "Break it upon the first man who breaks this law." The woman's fingers closed like roots around the wood. At night song, Lady Karen received the Dragon Queen with a brow cool enough to put out half a fire. She had eyes that weighed, and a mouth that had taught a dozen men to sit and listen until she had done speaking. "My hall is not yours," she said. "My swords are not yours. My heart is not yours. Yet I am not your enemy." "Then you are not mine," Daenerys said. She had learned from the Reeve and the Hedge Knight. She had learned from Viserys also, but those were lessons she locked away. "If you wish to be still, be still. The wind will move around you. If you wish to lean, I will be there to hold you up. If you wish to push, I will push back." She smiled, a thin thing that wounded no one. "But if you break your bread with me and then sell me for salt, I will not forget." Lady Karen's mouth softened. "Eat then," she said. "After we eat, we will walk my walls and look at the reach." A thing is easier to love when one is not afraid of it. They ate a little, they walked a long while. At the end Lady Karen did not bend, but she did not close her gates behind Daenerys's back either, and in the Stormlands that was a sort of oath. Aegon moved on Buckler and took it with a ladder and a tail. The tale said that dragons had landed in Dorne because the gods had sent them to scourge the Reach, and that the Reach would burn rose petals and call it incense and ask men to bow to the smoke. Jon Connington watched him fight with the cold detachment of a man who has thrown his own body at a wall too often and now values the ones who climb. The boy fought with a clean economy that boded well for his old age if he lived to have it. Do not be beautiful, Jon Connington wanted to tell him. Be necessary. He said nothing because some truths cannot be taught by saying. Victarion took to the rein as to a familiar woman with new scars. He set his ships to the coast like dogs set to a hedge and drove off 3 fat cogs that would have fed half an army for half a week and sent them down the coast under ironborn hands to a cove where Dornishmen with cold eyes counted sacks and made new lists. He burned a small watchtower and left a strip of char running up a dune like a lash mark. When he slept with his hand near the place where the horn had been. He woke once with the taste of Valyrian steel in his mouth, though he had not put his tongue to any blade. And in his dream Euron smiled without lips and offered him a cup that had something alive in it. He spat upon the deck and went out into the rain until his hair lay on his scalp like weeds, and the night scrubbed the dream from him. Moqorro's brazier burned steady through every downpour. He spoke little, and when he did his words lay like coals in the mine to be picked up later when one needed heat. Grey Worm went to him once and asked, "Do your fires show me dying?" "They show all men dying," Moqorro said without cruelty. Grey Worm nodded as if he had been told that spears were made of wood. "Then I will die well," he said, and went away. The priest watched him go with a look that was not pity and not approval and could not be summoned by men who cared which it was. At the wall, the wind had new voices in it, and the ravens cocked their heads as if the air had learned a new trick they intended to steal. Jon Snow did not look south often, but when he did he let his eyes rest a long time where the world's edge blurred. Bowen Marsh came with a complaint about bacon, and Jon signed something and spoke to someone and set a watch and wrote a letter and slept an hour and woke to the horn of his own men and thought of other horns and put the thought away. "We are the dark," he told himself in the way one touches a scar when it aches and calls it a friend so as not to hate it. "We eat fear so others do not have to choke on it." King's Landing slept worse. Rumors made beds hard. The gold cloaks took new orders that contradicted old ones, and the men who gave them learned to say the last order one shade louder. Qyburn went down into the dark places and came up with ideas that had teeth but no tongues. Cersei stood on her balcony and imagined a sky with 3 small smudges and let her hand curl upon the stone like a claw. Somewhere a child cried with hunger and then stopped because a girl with a loaf found him and broke it in half. The girl did not know a queen's name. She knew only that hunger had 2 faces and the smaller one could be fed if you did not show it the larger's teeth. Daenerys slept and woke and slept again and found her dreams crowded. Sometimes she dreamt of grass and sometimes of chains and sometimes of a throne made of swords that cut even when she did not move, and once she dreamed of a ribbon, half crimson, half orange, binding her wrist to another wrist, and when she looked the other hand's skin was darker than hers and the nails clean and oiled, and she woke and knew it was Arianne's ribbon and wondered idly how many such ribbons the princess had cut her life into and placed in how many bodices. She smiled and let herself fall asleep again because that was a pleasant thought, and there were too few of those in marching weather. They moved up through felled hedges and ruined culverts and fields where wet hay lay matted and useless. Men came out of little places with big names and offered fealty on condition that the apples not be taken and that their daughters not be looked at with warrior eyes. Daenerys agreed to both with the calm of a woman who knew what she would keep and what she would not. She sent men to mend a bridge and stood with her cloak clapped close to watch them work until she could feel the rhythm of hammer upon peg in her own wrist. "This is what a queen is," she told Missandei later, rubbing the ache. "A woman whose wrist hurts for other men's work." Missandei smiled like a girl and like an old woman at once and wrote something on her wax and did not say it aloud. A raven found them in a little church by a stand of beech, its wings ragged from a storm. The message was from Lady Olenna Tyrell, written in a hand neat and frank, full of little hooks that made one smile. It said, in essence, that fires burn quickly and gardens last, and that a girl with dragons might still be a fool. It invited Daenerys to think of bread instead of smoke and to come into the Reach to taste both. "She will feed you and poison you and say you were greedy," Arianne said when she read it. "She is a mother and a spider and a rose." "I will meet her," Daenerys said. "Not now, not until the Stormlands are mine. I will not be drawn into a garden while my men stand in rain." She sent Lady Olenna a polite insult bound up in courtesy, and laughed when she sealed it and felt younger for it. Aegon sent two from a holdfast whose name men had forgot because names wash away when owners do. His letter was brief. He had taken 3 small places and one of moderate size. He had set fair taxes. He had hanged a man who had cut the fingers from a frightened baker for hoarding flour that had belonged to the man's own mother. "He will make mistakes," Barristan said. "He will also make fewer of the cheap ones." Daenerys wondered what cheap ones were. She supposed cheap meant only that they were already paid for. At last they came to a road that ran like a spine to the east and to the west, and Daenerys halted her army upon it. Before them lay a little valley with a stream that made a bright seam. Beyond that there was a ragged hedge, and beyond the hedge a field, and beyond the field a rise. The rise held trees. The trees held archers. Randyll Tarly liked his sums clean. He had made a neat sum here: ground, cover, range, reserve. He counted her men with his eyes and set his jaw as if agreeing with an adversary who had said something intelligent and unpleasant. The Tyrell banners snapped above him, all green and gold and confidence. He waited. He did not shout. He did not send drums to make men braver than they were. He let the rain talk for him. Daenerys looked and saw, as a rider sees when she comes to a river and must choose to ford, ferry, or find another place. "He will not move until I do," she said. "He has taught himself to be a door. I will not be forced to be a shoulder only." She turned to Grey Worm. "We will not break ourselves on his archers. We will make his sums wrong." She lifted her face into the wet and whistled, a sharp little sound. Drogon descended through the cloud like a piece of night that had changed its mind. He came low over the stream and shook water from his wings and hung and screamed once. The Tyrell horses went mad like puppets cut loose. Archers loosed too soon and cursed and tried to string with wet fingers. Daenerys did not order fire. She did not want a field of ash and men black and shrunk to half their size. She wanted fear. She wanted respect. She wanted the first lesson to be this: a dragon can be above you without ending you, and therefore if you live, it is because the dragon has a queen who chooses it. Drogon made 3 passes. On the 3rd he took a sheep from the edge of the field with the careless insolence of a god, and tore it in the air, and let half of it fall onto Randyll Tarly's banner. Men flinched. Tarly's mouth tightened to a line that would cut if you were foolish enough to touch it. Daenerys sent the Unsullied to the hedge in columns, shields set. They went through the thorns like a square knife. Behind them came Dornishmen with spears long and light and legs that loved uneven ground. Behind them came men from Weeping Town and the little places, walking like men who know the difference between owning something and being allowed to use it. The first flight of arrows struck the Unsullied square like rain on tile. The second struck less well, because the archers now had dragons in their faces, and the math of fear is never as clean as the math of range. Tarly held. He would always hold. When he saw he could not hold without paying too much, he withdrew with the neatness of a surgeon losing a finger to save a hand. They took the rise, and then the next, and then the road beyond. It was no great battle. Songs would make it foolish if any songmaker wasted breath on it. Yet when it was done, Daenerys stood upon the stump of a hedgerow oak and looked down and saw the first piece of the Stormlands that was hers by more than promise. She let herself smile then, small and private and quickly gone. The rain had slacked. A rag of blue showed beyond cloud. Missandei came with her wax and wrote something down that Daenerys would not ask to hear, because she trusted the girl to make better sense of her days than most old men would in books. Night came with a gentler hand. Fires were lit where fires were safe. Barristan sat with Yora and did not speak, and that was a good talk for both of them. Arion came, hair wet and eyes brighter for it, and reported which lords had sent polite replies stuffed with traps, and which had sent honest refusals that could be turned into honest agreements later. Victarion stood by the bank with his boots in mud and stared at the place where the river went around a bend and out of sight, as if a thought had taken that path and he could bring it back by glaring. Makoro watched the smoke and said nothing, for the smoke said enough. Daenerys lay down in a tent that smelled of oiled wool and tallow and rain and missandei and old leather, and sleep came quicker than she had predicted. She dreamed of a door that opened onto a hall of swords, and of a boy with Rhaegar's chin closing it without fear, and of a woman with a crown of roses offering her a cup in which bread floated like a drowned thing, and of a man with a lion's smile who had only one eye, and that eye full of sky. She woke with the first cold and took her cloak and went out and stood in the mist and smelled wet thyme and horses and the iron tang that comes from men living and men having almost died and not. Drogon came down like a falling star and folded himself beside her without touching her, and laid his head near her boot, as if to remind her that gods can pretend to be dogs if they love you. She reached and put her hand upon the hot bar of his jaw. Strong enough, she told the night and the dragon and the road and the men who would stand in her way and the men who had stood aside. For dragons and for me. The mist took her breath and gave it back stranger. Somewhere far off a bell rang, thin and out of place in the stormlands, and the sound slid across the fields like a memory of a city she had not yet seen. She closed her eyes and saw it for the briefest of breaths. Hills and river and a keep at a bend of the world, and a gate with a woman in it who wore gold where her heart should be and smiled as if smiles had knives in them. She opened her eyes and only mist remained. The road ran on. The morning would come, and with it messengers and horses and bread and knives and letters and men with clean hands and men with dirty hearts. She laughed once, the softest of sounds. Then she drew her cloak closer and went to wake her army.